Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 14th of March of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Russia, because the most important updates are coming from this territory. The US Special Representative Steve Witkoff arrived yesterday to Moscow, where he had talks and conversation and negotiations with the Russian Special Representative Ushakov. Later, we got information that Steve Witkoff had conversation and had talks also with the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. At least this information was provided us by the press secretary, Mr. Peskov. Putin received US Special Envoy Witkoff late yesterday evening, and according to information we have, Putin passed on information to Trump through him. That was a letter. At least we have this information in the open sources. And those were the only updates during the previous 24 hours about the results of the negotiation process between the Russian Federation and the United States of America. And several hours ago, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, on his social networks published probably one of the most important and the most interesting updates during since the beginning probably of the Russian Sudzha counteroffensive operation. We had very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin of Russia yesterday, and there is a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. But at this very moment, thousands of Ukrainian troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military and in a very bad and vulnerable position. So most likely Donald Trump was talking about the Ukrainian soldiers that were caught in cauldron by the Russians in the vicinity of the Sudzha agglomeration. I have strongly requested to President Putin that their lives must be spared. This would be a horrible massacre, one not seen since World War II. God bless them all. That was stated by Donald Trump today in his social networks. And this is very important because basically Donald Trump was asking Vladimir Putin to show mercy to these Ukrainian soldiers. And obviously currently everybody has just one question: whether the Russians shown this requested mercy or are going to show this mercy or not. And if you ask my opinion, I believe that Vladimir Putin will accept this demand, will accept this request more precisely, and not just because Vladimir Putin wants to show himself from this side, wants to show that he can show mercy to the Ukrainian soldiers, not because of that. You know that in 2022 there was a very interesting and very similar situation, but in 2022 the same situation took place in the area of the city of Kherson. If you remember, in 2022 the Ukrainians launched counter-offensive operation, and as a result of that counter-offensive operation, the armed forces of the Russian Federation were forced to fall back from the city of Kherson and from the Ukrainian side of the river of Dnipro. And basically the Russians were caught in cauldron there. It wasn't like the cauldron as we can see right now in Sudzha, but the Ukrainians, as a result of HIMARS strike in 2022, managed to destroy every single bridge along the Dnipro river. Basically the Russians didn't have supply and support, and according to information we have, during that process, during that situation in 2022, the Russian General Valery Gerasimov, not just General, Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, called Mark Milley. And Mark Milley used to have the similar position in the US Army as Valery Gerasimov. And in 2022, Russian General asked Mark Milley not to attack the Russians and to allow the Russians to cross the river of Dnipro and to save the Russian soldiers' lives. That was the request from Valery Gerasimov to Mark Milley, and according to information we have, the United States allowed the Russians to do this in 2022. So that's why we believe that Putin has some debts to the United States of America, and now we understand that most likely Russia, Putin himself, will give the debts to the United States of America by this action. Most likely the Russians will show mercy to these Ukrainians, and they will allow them them to fall back from this pocket towards the settlement of Yunakivka. Currently, we can say about the thousands of Ukrainians that were caught in Cauldron, and the situation for them is very difficult. Obviously, it's not the same number of forces that the Russians managed to save in 2025, but in 2022, but the situation is almost similar. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about the Sumi direction, where the situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult. According to information we have, the Russians are about to begin something very interesting and something very strange in this area. The sources reported that the Russians began crossing the border with Sumi Oblast along the entire line, starting, let's say, from the northern part till the southern part. This is the article that was published by the Ukrainian sources. The Russian armored forces have become more and more active in the Sumi region. Sabotage and reconnaissance groups are trying to enter the Sumi region along almost the entire border, the head of the Sumi Regional Military Administration stated. So this is exactly the question about the security zone that was raised by the president of Putin yesterday during all those talks and conversations and negotiations. As for the situation on the ground, by the end of the 14th of March of 2025, the Russians managed to improve their positions, but obviously we can say one thing: the Russians slowed down. They slowed down, and we see that they're attacking. Of course, they're moving, but their attacks became less active. They started facing some resistance from the Ukrainian side. And for example, for the previous 24 hours, we have just one area that was colored in Russian favor, and this is the territory in the vicinity of Alexandria, Miropolia, Garnal, and Guyeva. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they were withdrawing and attacking the Russians in this area, those Russians who were trying to cross the border with Sumi region, and those Russians who were trying to attack deep inside of the territory of Ukraine. As you can see, the Ukrainians managed to repel this attack, but anyway, despite the fact that the Ukrainians most likely managed to repel that attack, we have adjusted this part of Sumi region in Russian favor. Furthermore, according to information we have, for now, without any geolocations and without any confirmations, the Russians managed to take under control these huge forests along the border. The Russians managed to reach the outskirts of the settlement of Oleshnya. The Russians, according to information we have, secured the settlement of Ubanshina, and the Russians managed to clear the pocket to the north between the settlement of Sverdlikova, Kazachya, Loknya. So the Russians are getting closer and closer to the border. The Ukrainians continue suffering losses, and currently the situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult. But once again, we believe that the Russians will allow and Putin will show mercy, because the debts must be paid, and there in political world this is obvious thing. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the northern Kupyansk direction, where the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks. Today, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Ukrainians, as a result of counter-offensive operation, managed to restore control over the settlement by the name of Fegolivka. Once again, this information was provided us by pro-Ukrainian map service, and I'll remind you that probably for the previous several days we've been talking a lot about Ukraine counterattacks in this area. The Ukrainians were attacking both on the Russian side of the river Voskol and on the Ukrainian one. As for attack on the Russian side of the river Voskol, the Ukrainians managed to dig in deeper between the Russian positions on the Ukrainian side and the settlements of Liman and Simkovka. Now the Ukrainians restored this position. All these things tell us that Ukrainians realize and understand the value of this area, and that despite and regarding the losses, they will try to force the Russians to fall back from this territory. So the most important thing is just ahead of us. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the central Kupyansk direction, where the Ukrainians from the 3rd Storm Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine tried to counterattack the Russian positions in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Nadia. This attack failed. The Russians managed to repel that attack and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, but we have colored some territories in Ukrainian favor, those territories that were considered as a contested area. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation probably from the most important, the most interesting territory. Let's discuss the situation in the Sloviansk Siversk direction, where the Russians began another full-scale offensive operation with the purpose probably to dig in deeper between two strongholds, the strongholds of Sloviansk and the strongholds of Siversk and to try to defeat the Ukrainians completely. As for now, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly in the settlement by the name of Vasikovka. The Russians carried out very interesting maneuver that allowed them to cut the settlement into parts, the eastern one and the western one. And by the end of the 14th of March of 2025, the Russians managed to establish almost complete control over the settlement, over the eastern part of this settlement. In this video, we can see how the Ukrainians, after they were forced to fall back from this territory, were bombing and attacking the Russian positions on the territory of the eastern part. Before this video, we got another video published by the Russian side, how a convoy of 4 personnel, infantry fighting carriers, and probably up to 30 soldiers of the Russian forces were attacking the central part of the settlement, and based on this video we have adjusted the map. So, for example, this is the situation by the end of the 30th of March. The Ukrainians had strong control over this territory, but by the end of the 14th of March, the Russians managed to defeat the Ukrainians, and most likely the settlement of Vasikovka will fall in Russian hands during the next days. Before this attack, the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian artillery positions, trying to destroy as many as possible Ukrainian guns, and after these counter-artillery duels, the Russians began that breakthrough. So let's wait for additional updates from this territory, because something tells me that the Russians will try to improve their positions and they will continue offensive operation further in the northern direction with the purpose to cut Siversk from supply and support from the west. If the Russians are able to complete this mission, this is going to be obviously another collapse of the armored force of Ukraine, almost the same as we saw yesterday in the area of Sudzha. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the city of Toretsk, where we can see very heavy clashes between the Russians and the Ukrainians. As you can see, we have a lot of changes on the ground. The map has been updated significantly since yesterday. And the main updates are coming from the southern part. Today, according to several neutral mappers, the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions in the Zabalka micro district. So one part was colored in the Ukrainian favor. But later we got another video published by the Ukrainian side where they were FPV droning and attacking the Russians in the southern part of the Zabalka micro district in this area. Based on this video, we have adjusted this part. So as you can see, there are very heavy clashes, and most likely there is something like a mix of Russian and Ukrainian positions there. Furthermore, the Russians continue restoring territories they lost during Ukraine counterattack in the northern part. Let's take a look at the changes. As you can see, several blocks were restored in the northwestern part and several blocks were restored in the most northern part of the settlement, based on the videos published by the Ukrainian side. In this video, we can see another FPV drone attack on the Russian soldiers in the northern part. In this video, we can see almost the same video, another FPV drone attack on the Russian positions in the northwestern part. Several pro-Russian resources reported that by the end of the 14th of March of 2025, the Russians managed to restore control over the entire northern part of the city of Toretsk, and there is just one block micro-district left, the Zabalka micro-district. Now let's move further, let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction, where the clashes continue between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are counter-attacking from every single side, trying to force the Russians to fall back. The Russians from their side use the active defense maneuvers to defeat the Ukrainians and to save control over the territories the Ukrainians are attacking. As for the territory of Shevchenko, we believe that despite different changes on map, some of them were made in Russian favor, some of them were made in Ukrainian favor. Despite this configuration, we believe that the entire settlement of Shevchenko is currently located in the gray zone. Here we can see almost the same situation as we can see currently in the Zabalka micro district in the city of Toretsk. Very close combat, one building under Russian control, another building under Ukrainian control, maybe sometimes one floor under Russian control, the second floor is under Ukrainian control. So there is another mix where the Ukrainians are trying to force the Russians to fall back, because almost, let's take a look, just simple situation. Let's upload the updates for the 9th of March of 2025, and let's take a look at how the map was changing. This is the situation by the end of the 10th of March. This is the situation by the end of the 11th of March. This is the situation by the end of the 14th of March, and this is the situation by the end of, let's say, 14th. So as you can see, every day we're making changes, sometimes in the Ukrainian favor, sometimes in the Russian favor, which means that currently nobody has the exact situation, exact picture of the settlement. And this is from one side, but from another side, we understand that due to the fact that both sides don't count losses during the battle for the settlement, which means that this is probably one of the most important and valuable position that can be controlled by anybody. From the western flank, we have adjusted the map based on the video published by the Ukrainian side to the south of the settlement of Udachne. In this video, we can see how the Ukrainians were, after withdrawing the Russian soldiers in the fields, that were moving towards the border between Dnipro and Donetsk regions. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources reported that as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to take under control the central part of the settlement. As for this village, Uspienovka, here we can see the same situation as we can see in Shevchenko and Zabalka. Very heavy clashes, and sometimes the village changes its owner for several times a day. So it's completely covered with gray zone without any understanding when the battle is going to be finished. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the south, the next direction. The Russians resumed their offensive operation on the Ukrainian positions, and according to pro-Ukrainian mappers, the Russians managed to improve and to take under control several tree lines between Razdolna and Dnipro-Energia. Furthermore, the Ukrainian Russian sources published the video from the settlement of Dnipro-Energia, where we can see 3 Russian soldiers that raised Russian flag in the most central part of the settlement. Based on this video, we haven't adjusted anything because the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation several days ago confirmed Russian control over this territory, so now we just got another proof from the Russian side. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to enter the settlement of Vilnia Polia. So this is interesting because we see that after a very short operational pause, the Russians resumed their attempts to attack, despite different reports from pro-Ukrainian and neutral mappers that Ukrainians counter-attack in the area of Burlatska and that Ukrainians counter-attack in the area of Novosilka. So here, very interesting situation, and the battle for Shevchenko is about to be started, and if the Russians can take Shevchenko under control, this is going to become a very powerful stronghold for the Russians for further offensive. As for the Zaporizhzhia direction, during the previous 24 hours, several neutral mappers confirmed additional progress on the ground of the armored force of the Russian Federation towards the settlement of Mali Sherbaki. So these are the changes for the previous 24 hours. Currently, it's very difficult to understand whether this is a real offensive towards the siege of Zaporizhzhia or something like this, or the Russians are trying to repeat the story that took place in 2023 before the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation. According to information we have, the Russians entered in 2023 the settlement of Mali Sherbaki before the beginning of the Ukrainian attack, just to improve their positions and to maintain the gray zone. Maybe the Russians are doing right now the same. They're attacking with the purpose to repel possible Ukrainian attacks that are going to take place in the very near future. Because according to Trump, during the negotiation process between Vladimir Putin and Trump, lots of questions, lots of issues were raised about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, because Zelensky in Ukraine, despite how exactly this war is going to be ended, the Ukrainians want to save control over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But 3 days ago, Zelensky was planning to change Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant for the Sudzha direction, but now Zelensky is no longer has these Trump cards and he will not be able to do this, but he still wants to restore control over this territory. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.